17-year-old Emma Harris was wrongfully detained by fake security guards right outside her own home, simply because she didn't look like she belonged. The men, acting with arrogance and unchecked authority, treated her like an intruder in the neighborhood she'd lived in her entire life. What they didn't know, her father, Alexander Harris, was the billionaire who secretly owned the entire HOA they thought they controlled. But just wait until you see how this story turns, and why, in the end, justice didn't just return, it roared. It was a golden Saturday afternoon when the sun, slowly sinking behind the sycamore-lined gates of Magnolia Estates, bathed everything in a soft, amber glow. 17-year-old Emma Harris adjusted the strap of her worn canvas backpack and stepped onto the curved sidewalk leading to her neighborhood's main entrance. The distant hum of sprinklers and a lawnmower somewhere blended with the chirping of birds, giving the place its usual idyllic charm. She had just left the town library, her favorite weekend ritual, with a few books tucked neatly inside. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged, her mind still lingering on a passage she had just read from a book on Yale's campus life. It wasn't the place she dreamed of one day calling home. Emma wasn't dressed like most kids in the neighborhood that afternoon. She wore gray sweatpants and an oversized hoodie with the university's logo faintly faded on the front. Her hair, once in a neat braid, had come partially loose, and she didn't mind. She was in her element, thoughts full of ideas, eyes set on goals, and heart untouched by the weight of assumptions. She passed through the ornate iron gate as it opened automatically for a resident's car ahead of her. It was a routine she had gone through 100 times. Nothing about it felt unusual. Not yet. But then came the screech of tires, abrupt, violent, jarring. A matte black SUV halted so close, the rubber tires kissed the curb. Two men stepped out, uniformed, both tall, built, wearing navy shirts emblazoned with a bold HOA security patch. They moved with a practiced authority that made it clear. They believed they were in control. One of them, stockier and older, stepped forward. His name tag read, J. Miller. "Where's your access card?" he asked, eyes narrowing, tone more accusatory than inquisitive. "You live here?" Emma froze, caught off guard. "Yes, I live on Oak Ridge Lane, house 327. I just came from—" "Where's your ID?" he snapped, already stepping closer. The second man, silent but alert, moved around behind her, as if blocking a non-existent escape route. Emma's hands trembled as she reached into her backpack. "I don't carry my ID when I walk home, but I have my house key." She pulled it out, holding it up as proof. It glinted briefly in the sunlight before Miller snatched it from her hand, inspecting it, as if it were a forged document. "This doesn't prove anything," he muttered, glancing at his partner. "Could have found this anywhere." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Please, just call my dad. He's—" "We'll wait for an actual officer," Miller interrupted, his words cold and dismissive. "Until then, you're not going anywhere." Before she could react, the second man moved behind her again. She turned, trying to back away instinctively, but she felt pressure on her wrists, then the cold metallic snap. Once, twice. As the zip ties locked into place, she gasped, more from shock than pain, her legs giving way as she was lowered to the ground onto the grass. Cars passed. Some slowed down. One woman in a Range Rover looked, hesitated, then drove on. "I live here," Emma said again, quieter this time. Her voice, filled with disbelief, seemed to hang in the air, unheard. The sounds of suburbia, sprinklers, birds, lawnmowers, continued as if nothing was happening. The men didn't respond. Miller paced slowly, checking something on a clipboard, while the other stood over her like a shadow. Emma's face flushed with heat and confusion. How had this moment turned so quickly, so unfairly? "You don't match the profile," one of them muttered. She didn't even understand what that meant. A breeze picked up, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, a cruel contrast to the surreal and humiliating situation unfolding. Her books had spilled from her backpack. One, the Yale admissions guide, lay open on the pavement beside her. Miller looked down at it, sneered faintly, then turned away. Emma shut her eyes for a second, praying someone, anyone, would stop, recognize her, speak up. But the foot traffic remained distant. Neighbors averted their gaze, too unsure or too unwilling to question what they saw. She heard the words again, the final insult as if stamped onto her dignity. "We'll wait for a real officer." That address? Probably fake anyway. In that moment, sitting there on the grass with her hands bound and pride torn, Emma Harris felt something unfamiliar for the first time in her life. Not fear, but fury. It burned quiet and deep, because she knew. They didn't just see a girl. They saw someone who, in their minds, didn't belong. And they had no idea whose daughter she really was. Emma sat motionless on the manicured grass, her wrists bound and fingers numb, the warmth of the setting sun unable to chase away the cold blooming in her chest. The soft hiss of sprinklers continued nearby, watering the flower beds that lined the sidewalks of Magnolia Estates, a neighborhood that prided itself on order, safety, and reputation. She had walked these streets for years. She had grown up waving to dog walkers, collecting candy during Halloween, and helping organize community cleanups. But now, seated like a stranger in her own home, all she received were sidelong glances and hurried footsteps. The first passerby was a woman Emma vaguely recognized from the neighborhood committee, Mrs. Langford, always in pastels, always with a sun hat. She paused when she saw Emma on the ground, eyes widening. For a second, their gazes locked. Emma opened her mouth to speak, to ask for help. But Mrs. Langford quickly looked away, adjusted her purse, and crossed to the other side of the street. Another neighbor walked by moments later, Mr. Clarkson. Her father occasionally golfed with him on Saturdays. Emma had even visited his home once for a holiday party. As he passed, he slowed just enough to assess the scene, then pulled the brim of his cap lower and pretended to take a call. He didn't even acknowledge her. Emma's throat tightened. Her voice, dry and shaking, forced its way out. "Please, someone call my dad, please." But before the words could fully escape, one of the security men barked, "Quiet down." She flinched, not just from the command, but from how quickly her plea had been dismissed. The other man didn't even glance her way. He just stood nearby, arms crossed, exuding control as if her silence was part of his job. More residents passed, a woman pushing a stroller, earbuds in, a jogger, who slowed momentarily before resuming his stride. A teenage boy riding a bike swerved slightly, staring with wide eyes, then pedaled faster and disappeared around the bend. No one stopped, no one questioned, no one intervened. Each non-reaction hit harder than the last. Not because she expected them to know the full story, but because they knew her, or at least she thought they did. Emma's thoughts raced, colliding in confusion and disbelief. How could this be happening here? In the same neighborhood where she had sold lemonade as a kid, the same sidewalks where she walked her dog, the same clubhouse where she swam every summer. Had she really become invisible the moment she no longer fit a certain image? She looked down at her sweatshirt, the same one she wore at home when reading or doing homework. Was that it? Was it because she wasn't in a dress or tennis skirt like the girls most of them expected to see here? Was it the way her hair had come undone? Or simply that she wasn't walking beside an adult with a visible ID around her neck? A lump rose in her throat. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep the tears from falling, but it was no use. The ache in her chest grew heavier with each heartbeat. She didn't just feel scared. She felt rejected, cast out from a world she thought she belonged to. The uniformed men didn't speak. They loomed. Occasionally they muttered to each other as if debating something, but never looked at her like a person. Just a problem, a possible threat. A girl to be contained until someone more qualified arrived. Their expressions remained unreadable. Professional, maybe. But not empathetic, not curious, not human. Emma tried again. "My dad's name is Alexander Harris. He's—" The second man cut her off with a glance. "Didn't we tell you to keep quiet?" His tone wasn't angry, just disinterested, like he had already made up his mind about who she was and why she didn't belong. Her heart pounded, louder than the passing cars. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a dismissal of her very presence. As if the neighborhood had agreed, silently and collectively, that she no longer fit into their picture. As if all the smiles, greetings, and block parties had been nothing but surface-level convenience. For the first time, Emma truly understood what it meant to feel alone in a crowd. Not because there wasn't anyone nearby, but because everyone nearby had chosen not to see her. She lowered her head, the corners of her vision blurring. The weight pressing against her chest was no longer just fear. It was sorrow, betrayal, and something deeper. The realization that even in a place that promised security, kindness, and unity, those ideals could dissolve the moment perception was challenged. And yet, deep beneath the growing weight of humiliation, something stirred, a flicker of heat. Not shame, but something else. A quiet, burning question. If they won't see me now, will they see me later, when they realize who my father is? She didn't want revenge. She wanted recognition, not for who her family was, but for who she had always been. A neighbor, a daughter, a student, a person. And in that moment, silent and still beneath a sky quickly fading into twilight, Emma Harris made a decision. Not to disappear, not to be erased, but to endure. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater than any of them could imagine. In the glass-towered heart of downtown, where city lights flickered even before dusk fell and polished conference tables stretched like runways between executives, Alexander Harris sat in a private boardroom 32 floors above the noise. Around him, voices droned on about market expansion, quarterly shifts, projections, the kind of numbers most people couldn't imagine, let alone influence. But Alexander didn't just imagine them. He shaped them, quietly, methodically, and always from the shadows. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. His power never required noise. He had built his empire on precision and privacy, investments behind shell companies, charitable work through unnamed foundations, influence through silence. His name rarely appeared in headlines, but his decisions shaped the very industries those headlines covered. As the meeting reached its midpoint, his assistant, a sharp, discreet woman named Naomi, entered without knocking. That alone was enough for Alexander to pause. Naomi didn't interrupt unless it mattered. She leaned in and spoke just above a whisper, but the words landed like thunder. "There's an officer reported at your residence, sir. HOA security requested assistance, something involving your daughter." Time stilled. Alexander's pen, previously gliding across a set of documents, froze mid-signature. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but Naomi saw the change. His eyes narrowed, jaw tightened, barely. But to those who knew him, it was a seismic shift. He rose without apology or explanation. The room fell silent. One executive asked, "Is everything all right, Mr. Harris?" Alexander simply replied, "We're done here," then walked out, phone already in hand. In the elevator descending 32 floors, he didn't call his daughter. He knew better. If something had happened and she was unable to answer, each unanswered ring would only raise more questions, more panic. Instead, he called his private head of security, a former federal investigator named Royce. "Find out who's at my house," Alexander said, voice like cold steel. "Now!" Royce didn't ask questions. He just responded with a brisk, "On it!" As the elevator doors opened to the valet level, Alexander moved with purpose. A black sedan, always waiting, pulled forward. Naomi was already beside it, tablet in hand, pulling up the latest feed from the private server tied to his estate. That estate, the pristine, gated neighborhood of Magnolia Estates, was more than just home. Years ago, during a bitter divorce, Alexander had moved there with his then 5-year-old daughter, seeking calm, simplicity, and control. He didn't trust faceless boards or sluggish associations. So, quietly, using a Delaware-based trust, he had purchased the HOA's management company outright. No one in the community knew. To them, he was the reserved man who drove a modest Tesla and attended a few HOA meetings only when necessary. He let others play at being in charge, presidents of committees, block captains, enforcement officers. They believed they ran the show. He allowed that belief to stand, because true power, he believed, worked best when invisible, until now. As the car sped through evening traffic, Alexander stared out the window, his mind racing. The image of his daughter, bright, thoughtful, book-loving Emma, being involved in any incident with law enforcement didn't compute. She was calm, careful, private, like him. Whatever this was, it didn't make sense. Unless someone had forgotten who she was. No, worse. Unless they never knew. His grip tightened on the phone as Royce's call came through. Alexander answered before the first ring finished. There was a report made by HOA security. 2 individuals, names, Jared Miller and Thomas Green. They claimed a teenage girl was trespassing. Said she couldn't prove she lived there. Local PD was dispatched but hasn't arrived yet. Emma appears to be held at the neighborhood security station, without charges. Alexander exhaled once, controlled. Then, held? Yes, sir. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I want their names, their files, their certifications, and every piece of footage from the last 2 hours. It's being pulled now. Alexander ended the call. His reflection in the car window stared back at him, composed, but colder than usual. The kind of cold that didn't come from absence of feeling, but from the presence of something sharper. Purpose. This was his neighborhood, his home, his sanctuary, and someone had taken it upon themselves to humiliate his daughter within its gates. There was a time when he might have let things unfold quietly, preferred diplomacy, sent lawyers instead of coming himself. But not now, not when the price of his silence had just been stamped across his daughter's dignity. As the gates of Magnolia Estates appeared ahead, flanked by stone pillars and trimmed hedges, Alexander leaned forward slightly. No more shadows, he murmured. It's time they learned who I am, or were. The small structure near the gated entrance of Magnolia Estates was never meant for more than paperwork and parking passes. It resembled a guard shack on the outside, with beige paneling and a dusty roof, but inside it was just a cramped, poorly ventilated room with a single desk, 2 mismatched chairs, and a flickering overhead light that buzzed in and out like a tired mosquito. It was here that Emma Harris, 17 years old and still in shock, was led with her wrists bound and her dignity slowly unraveling. The air inside was stifling. The windows were closed, blinds pulled halfway down. There were no visible security cameras, no monitors, no forms, nothing to suggest legitimacy. And more importantly, no actual police presence. Just the same 2 men who had pulled her off the sidewalk, acting under the banner of HOA security, as if the patch on their shirts gave them the right to detain a resident, like a suspect in some imagined crime. Jared Miller, the older, more vocal of the 2, motioned for her to sit in the metal chair closest to the wall. She obeyed, not because she felt she had to, but because she was too exhausted to do anything else. Her voice had failed her earlier, and now her body followed suit. Every part of her screamed with silent protest, but none of it found words. The second man, Thomas Green, lingered near the door, arms crossed and eyes distant, occasionally glancing out the window as if expecting someone, or perhaps hoping this would all go unnoticed. Inside the room, time thickened. Emma sat still, hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her hoodie was damp with sweat, the sleeves pulled tight under the zip ties that hadn't yet been removed. Her backpack lay in the corner, spilled open from earlier. Books, a highlighter, and a crushed protein bar wrapper sat untouched on the floor. Jared circled the desk, pretending to sort papers, though there were none. He glanced at Emma with a look that blended suspicion and condescension. Then, without warning, he leaned in. "What's that around your neck?" he asked. Emma blinked, confused. "The necklace," he added, pointing to the silver chain, barely visible beneath her collar. She instinctively reached for it, a small locket with her mother's initials engraved, one of the only things she wore every day. Before her fingers could touch it, Jared stepped closer, reaching out. "If it's stolen," he said casually, "your dad will probably thank us for returning it." Emma recoiled slightly, not out of fear, but from disbelief. It wasn't just the invasion of space, it was the tone, like he was doing her a favor, like this was some charitable act of protection rather than a baseless accusation cloaked in authority. He didn't remove the necklace, but the message was clear. Her tears returned, not in a burst, but as a slow, steady stream that traced the curve of her cheek, then her jaw. She didn't sob. She didn't shake. She just sat there, silently unraveling, one breath at a time. Her lips were pressed tight. Speaking now would only make it worse. Anything she said could be twisted, dismissed, or used to further justify what they were already doing. So she said nothing. The silence in the room was oppressive. The only sound was the dull hum of the overhead light and the occasional creak of Jared's chair as he shifted. He didn't ask her name again. He didn't ask if she needed water or to call someone. Because in his mind, there was no need. He had already decided who she was. She watched the second man, Thomas, with wary eyes. He wasn't speaking, but he wasn't stepping in either. He leaned against the far wall, arms folded, pretending detachment. But his silence wasn't neutral. It was permission. He may not have been the one pressing buttons, but he wasn't stopping them either. Emma's thoughts raced. Every minute that passed blurred into the next. She wondered if her dad knew, if he was calling, if anyone outside this claustrophobic little room even realized she was gone. Her phone was in her backpack, out of reach, probably already searched. Her sense of time, of control, of reality, all fading. She closed her eyes for a second, not to rest, but to escape. In her mind, she tried to picture something stable. Her room, her bookshelf, her dog Barkley, waiting by the front door, Yale brochures scattered across her desk. That quiet hope of the future, untouched by this moment, still intact somewhere just beyond reach. But it was hard to hold on to that image, because in this room she wasn't a student, she wasn't a daughter, she wasn't a neighbor. To them, she was a question mark they didn't feel obligated to answer, a face that didn't belong, a presence they felt compelled to contain. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the humiliation itself or the knowledge that these men genuinely believed they were right. Outside, the sky continued to darken, the sun dipping beneath the rooftops of Magnolia Estates. Streetlights clicked on. Life went on, but inside the small structure by the gate, Emma Harris remained suspended in a moment she hadn't asked for, unseen, unheard, and painfully aware that everything she had once believed about safety and familiarity had changed. 40 minutes. That was all it took for the balance of power in Magnolia Estates to shift forever. The silence that once protected Alexander Harris became his weapon. No motorcade, no black-suited entourage, no flashing lights. Just a single electric vehicle that pulled up to the side entrance of the gated community. The same entrance residents often forgot existed. He preferred it that way. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. And tonight, no patience for performance. As he stepped out, the crisp air met a stillness laced with unease. The street lamps had already flickered on, casting a pale glow over the trimmed hedges and cobbled driveways. Normally, this neighborhood resembled a brochure, pristine, manicured, proud. But tonight, it was a stage, and Alexander wasn't here to observe. He was here to reclaim. He didn't pause to check his reflection in the car window, though others might have. His tailored jacket was immaculate, but it wasn't the fabric that gave him presence. It was the silence around him, the kind that made you stand straighter without realizing it, the kind that warned of storms long before the sky darkened. He moved toward the main entrance, steps measured, shoulders squared. 2 men stood near the gatehouse, still in uniform, still carrying themselves with an air of authority they no longer possessed. Jared Miller and Thomas Green. Their faces registered only mild curiosity at first, perhaps assuming he was just another resident with questions. But when they saw where he was headed, past them, not toward them, their posture shifted. They straightened up. Jared took a breath, opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak. Alexander didn't acknowledge them, not even a glance. He passed within feet of them, eyes fixed on the small glass building that now held his daughter. Inside the makeshift office, lit by an overhead bulb that flickered once, Emma sat with her hands in her lap, eyes red, cheeks streaked. She didn't see him at first. Her gaze was down, her posture curled in on itself. But when she looked up, whether instinct or hope, and their eyes met through the glass, something unspoken passed between them. Not panic, not fear, but the unmistakable recognition of a line being crossed. He didn't speak. He didn't knock. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took out his phone, tapped the screen once, and held it to his ear. "Royce," he said quietly, tone absolute, "terminate the entire security staff for Magnolia Estates, effective immediately." There was a pause on the line, no hesitation, just swift understanding. Alexander continued, eyes still locked on his daughter. "And I want every second of surveillance from the last 2 hours. Gate cams, perimeter, internal. Forward all copies to my direct server. Now." Another pause, then a quiet, "Understood." And the line went dead. He returned the phone to his pocket. Behind him, the two men shifted uncomfortably. They were beginning to understand, not because he told them, but because the atmosphere had changed. The illusion of control they clung to had just cracked, and the man they had assumed to be another homeowner, another quiet resident with a mailbox and a mortgage, had revealed a truth far more potent than any badge on their uniform. Inside, Emma stood slowly. One of the guards opened the door, unsure whether to speak, to explain, to defend. But Alexander raised a single hand, not in greeting, not in warning, but as a command. "Don't speak." And they didn't, because something about him, the way he stood, the weight of silence, the precision of every movement, made it clear this was no longer their domain. Emma stepped outside, her first breath of fresh air sharper than expected. She moved toward him cautiously, but he met her halfway. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. Anger laced with restraint, pain masked by purpose, and a deep, undeniable promise. This will not be forgotten. The air between them held a moment only they understood. She didn't ask what he would do next. He didn't ask if she was all right. Both knew the answers already. And then, just as calmly as he arrived, Alexander turned to face the gatehouse one last time. The two men stood rigid, no longer security officers, no longer guardians of order, just employees who had mistaken authority for power. He didn't scold them. He didn't lecture. He simply gave them what they had denied his daughter: silence that judged deeper than words ever could. And with Emma beside him, Alexander walked away, not as a man reclaiming control, but as a father drawing a line the world would not cross again. The door creaked open with a sound sharper than it should have been, and for a brief moment the air inside the small guard station seemed to thicken. The two men, Jared Miller and Thomas Green, stepped out, their movements slower now, less sure. Jared walked first, his shoulders slightly hunched, eyes flickering from one corner of the entrance to the next, as if trying to anticipate what was coming. But what stopped him wasn't a uniform, or a badge, or even a crowd. It was a single figure standing near the main path, with his arms calmly folded, the glow of streetlights catching the edge of his cufflinks. Alexander Harris. The moment Jared's eyes landed on him, he stopped mid-stride. His mouth opened, words caught somewhere between recognition and regret. A thin film of sweat suddenly glistened across his forehead, despite the cool evening breeze. Is that, he stammered, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Alexander said, cutting through his uncertainty like a blade. "That's my daughter. And you," he paused, gaze fixed and steady, "are nobody." The words were spoken without emotion, but they hit like thunder. There was no need to raise his voice. The authority in his presence carried everything that needed to be said. Jared seemed to shrink under the weight of it, his bluster from earlier gone, replaced by something far less confident, something like fear. Behind them, the flashing lights of a local patrol vehicle had finally arrived. Real officers, not volunteers, not rent-a-badges, approached from behind, called in minutes earlier by Alexander himself. They didn't come in haste, but with quiet understanding. They had already been briefed. They knew who had made the call. One of the officers gestured towards Jared and Thomas. "We'll take it from here, sir." As the two men were guided aside for questioning, Thomas tried to speak first, his voice halting. We honestly thought she didn't belong. She had no ID, no tag. It was just protocol." Jared jumped in, his words stumbling over themselves. "She wasn't dressed like the others. We thought she snuck in." "You thought?" Alexander repeated, each syllable slow and deliberate. "You thought wrong." He took one step forward, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear that the conversation was no longer on their terms. "You're not law enforcement," he continued. "You're not licensed peace officers. You are barely certified for overnight patrol, and yet you detained a minor, physically, illegally, without a warrant, without cause." Jared opened his mouth again, but Alexander didn't pause. "You acted on appearance, on bias, on arrogance, not law, and now every second of that mistake is being recorded, reviewed, and sent to the board of directors, local authorities, and every resident who deserves to know who's been patrolling their neighborhood." He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, but his words cut through the quiet evening air like precision tools. "You don't represent safety," he said. "You represent failure, and you will not wear that badge again." The officers at their sides said nothing. They didn't need to. They simply nodded toward the men and began guiding them toward the back of the squad car, not under arrest, not yet, but under formal investigation, enough to shatter the illusion they had built for themselves in that uniform. Emma stood nearby now, just a few steps behind her father. She watched not with vindication, but with a strange, sobering calm. The people who had humiliated her were no longer invincible. They were just men who had overstepped, and now, for once, were being held accountable. Thomas muttered something again, a final attempt, perhaps, to regain control. "We were following protocol." Alexander turned to him one last time. "Protocol doesn't involve humiliation. Protocol doesn't involve assuming guilt based on how someone looks. And protocol doesn't give you the right to treat my daughter, or anyone's child, like a trespasser in their own home." He let the silence settle for a long second. "And now the only thing you're following is the path out." He didn't wait for a reply. With Emma beside him and the final pieces of authority dismantled, Alexander walked away, not toward his house, but toward the residents beginning to gather at a distance, drawn by the sirens and whispers. Soon they would learn the full truth. Who really owned the company behind their HOA, who had been watching silently, and who had decided, finally, to speak, not in revenge, in justice. The door opened with a mechanical click, and the two men who had just spent the last hour pretending they held authority walked out into a reality that no longer bent to their rules. Their steps were slower now, their posture less rigid, their certainty visibly shaken. Jared Miller led the way, his eyes scanning the small crowd beginning to gather near the entrance gate. It was then that his gaze met someone he hadn't expected, a man whose presence seemed to pull gravity toward him. Alexander Harris stood calmly just beyond the light of the awning, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his message unmistakably clear. Jared stopped mid-step. His breath caught, and for the first time that day, he looked truly unsure. His lips moved before his mind could form a full sentence. That's... Yes, Alexander said, his voice measured but sharp enough to cut. "That's my daughter. And you..." He paused, eyes fixed on Jared with quiet fire. "You're nobody." There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Just 5 words that collapsed the false hierarchy Jared had built around himself. It wasn't just an insult. It was a recalibration of reality. Behind them, 2 real officers stepped into the scene, called in by Alexander minutes prior. They moved with silent authority, their body language different from the men they were now questioning. These were trained professionals. There was no pretense, no confusion over boundaries. As the officers approached, Jared and Thomas shifted uneasily. The weight of what they had done was catching up to them in real time. "We didn't know," Thomas mumbled, his voice low, eyes darting toward Emma, then back to Alexander. "We thought maybe she didn't live here. No ID, no badge. She didn't look like—" Alexander didn't let him finish. "You thought wrong," he said, still calm, still composed. "You assumed, you acted, and you humiliated her." Jared tried again, desperation flickering at the edge of his voice. "It was just precaution. We thought she might have—" "Might have what?" Alexander interjected. "Might have walked to her own home without your permission? Might have looked too casual for a place like this? Might have worn a hoodie instead of a dress code you made up in your heads?" Neither man answered. The silence said more than any defense ever could. "You're not police," Alexander continued, eyes cold, voice low but clear. "You're not even licensed security in any meaningful sense. Your certifications? Expired. Your authority? Fabricated. You work for a name on a badge, and that name happens to be mine." Thomas blinked, confused. Jared's face turned a deeper shade of gray. "Yes," Alexander said, stepping forward just slightly. "I own the management company that runs this HOA, the one that hired your service, or rather, used to." He glanced toward the officers, who gave a subtle nod before beginning their formal questioning. "You see," Alexander went on, "you didn't just detain a resident, you detained a minor, without justification, without oversight. You violated protocol, law, and basic human decency. And now?" He gestured subtly to the crowd now forming near the sidewalk. Residents, curious and concerned, whispered among themselves. Some recognized Alexander. Others began to realize what was happening. "Now they'll all know," Alexander said. "They'll know who made you feel like you had the right to act this way. And they'll know exactly what happens when you pretend power is yours to define." Jared looked as if he wanted to speak, but his words had abandoned him. The uniform that once made him feel important now looked like a costume, ill-fitting, undeserved. Emma, standing quietly nearby, didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The presence of her father, the truth in his voice, and the shift in the air were enough. Alexander turned to her, offering a nod. Not a question, not a demand, just assurance. She stepped closer, standing beside him. Together they faced the two men, not with anger, but with something more piercing, certainty. And then, as the officers began to lead Jared and Thomas toward their vehicle for further questioning, one of them made one last attempt. "We didn't mean harm," he said. "It was a mistake." Alexander looked at him, steady as stone. "No," he replied. "It was a choice, and now it has consequences." He didn't look back again. Instead, with Emma beside him and truth finally unveiled, he turned and walked away. Not as a man seeking retribution, but as a father who had just reminded a community that silence is not weakness, and that the quietest man in the room often holds the loudest truth. The community center at Magnolia Estates had never felt this quiet. Rows of chairs filled the main hall, residents seated with crossed arms and furrowed brows. For years, HOA meetings had been routine, a space for budget updates and landscaping debates. But tonight was different. The air held weight. People weren't here to discuss flower beds. They were here to hear from the man who had remained a mystery for so long. Alexander Harris entered without announcement. He walked to the front, not dressed to impress, but with a presence that drew every eye. For 3 years he had remained in the background, content to let others manage the face of the neighborhood. Tonight he stepped into the light, not as a businessman, not as a property owner, but as a father. He didn't start with a greeting or a joke. He simply stood still, looked across the room, and began. 3 nights ago, my daughter was detained by 2 individuals wearing security uniforms, he said. They weren't law enforcement. They weren't trained to assess threat or risk. They were hired under a flawed structure, one I funded, one I allowed to persist, and one that failed. The room remained still. No phones buzzed. No one whispered. I've stayed out of HOA matters publicly, but I can't do that anymore. Not when silence costs more than money. He paused for a breath, then continued. As of today, the current security structure is dissolved. Every contract tied to it is terminated. In its place, I'm proposing the creation of an independent oversight committee made up of residents. Not just board members or longtime owners, but young people too, teenagers, college students. Anyone who calls this place home deserves a voice. He let those words settle before finishing. My daughter won't get that evening back, but maybe, just maybe, no other child here will have to experience what she did. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. And for the first time, many in the room realized they weren't just neighbors. They were stewards of something greater, and they had the power to rebuild it. A week later, the gates of Magnolia Estates opened as they always had, but this time Emma Harris walked through them with her head held a little higher. The sidewalk she once feared was just a path again. The homes, once shadows of silence, now looked different, not because they'd changed, but because she had. Her steps were steady, her breath calm. The fear that once wrapped around her had loosened its grip. As she passed the familiar lawns and driveways, something unexpected happened. People began to greet her. Not in passing, not with shallow politeness, but with sincerity. A woman from 2 houses down, someone Emma had only ever seen pruning roses, walked across her lawn and gently said, "I'm so sorry, I should have spoken up." Emma simply nodded, accepting the apology with grace. Another neighbor offered to drive her if she ever needed anything. A retired man who had lived on the corner for years left a handwritten note in their mailbox. "You reminded us all of what matters." And then, as she neared her own street, a boy about her age approached. He had been in 2 of her classes. They'd never spoken much beyond group assignments, but now his face carried something deeper. Regret. "I saw the whole thing from my window," he said quietly. "I didn't know it was you. If I had—" She looked at him, not with judgment, but with a clarity that came from having seen people's true nature and still choosing hope. "If it was me or someone else," she replied, "does it matter?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, you're right. It shouldn't." Emma smiled gently. "That's the part we have to change." She didn't say it with anger or resentment. She said it because she believed it. What had happened to her wasn't just about one girl or one mistake, it was about a system of assumptions that needed to be questioned. And now, thanks to her voice, people were finally listening. The incident with Emma became more than just a moment of injustice. It became a catalyst for change. Alexander Harris, once content to stay behind the scenes, stepped forward with purpose. He no longer believed that wealth should be hidden behind gates or silence. Instead, he used it to amplify voices that had been ignored, especially the youngest ones in the community. He launched a new initiative called Neighborhood Voice, a digital platform designed to give residents a say in HOA decisions, to demand transparency, and to ensure that no voice, no matter how small, would ever be dismissed again. It encouraged youth participation, promoted local leadership, and rewrote the rules of representation. Emma, too, found her voice. When the time came to apply to Yale, she didn't hide from her story. She embraced it. Her admissions essay began with a single line that said everything. "I am the daughter of a billionaire, but one night no one recognized me, and in that moment I realized it's not who you are by birth that defines you, but what you're willing to stand for.